as if bobbing for apples. A long string of bloody sausages spread out along the ground, Norman realising that they were in fact the poor bastard's intestines. "Fuck me," he heard Lark said, before gagging. The dead didn't even hold his gaze, seeming immune and ambivalent to the torchlight. They greedily turned back to their meal like starving dogs. Norman watched them eat for a while, unable to take his eyes off the scene, as if it were a car crash. Their faces were strained and feral-looking, focused solely on the task of devouring the camouflage-clad body on the floor. One of the dead wore similar clothing, as if he too had once been a soldier. Norman noticed his arm was missing, the ragged remains of his sleeve hanging from his torso as if ashamed. For Norman, the scene had added poignancy. His brother had been a soldier for years. He had been just like Norman, even looked like him. Their mother had often referred to him as two peas in a pod. They were both messers in school, but his brother was a more sensitive one. Too big for his own skin, his mother used to say, constantly aware of himself. He left school as soon as he could, joined the army because it seemed like the only job that would have him. He had been recently drafted to Afghanistan, and Norman suddenly wondered if it was ironically safer there than he would be here. Norman raised his handgun and fired repeatedly until every head in the room was bloody pulp, flesh splashing violently around the walls like a bomb in an abattoir. There was no protest from any of them, each body falling limply to the floor, some jittering quietly as if slightly annoyed at having their meal disturbed. Within seconds the job was done. Norman waited until every body fell completely silent. He went to leave, but was halted by another sound from the perfect room. He stopped, turning towards the noise. In the midst of the bloody chaos, he could see a small shape scuttling along the back wall. He strained his eyes, shining his torchlight again, able to make out the body of a little girl. She was naked, blood coating her smooth, pale skin like red paint. She was licking it from her fingers as if it were strawberry sauce, staring up at him as if she had been caught stealing. Her innocence seemed somehow preserved. Even after her life, and everything that made her alive had left her, there was still that one quality, that one dynamic, innocence. She looked at Norman as if trying to melt his heart, trying to make him less cross with her for all the naughty things she had done. She scuttled away from the torch beam as if playfully, as if it were some kind of game. Norman could almost have sworn he made out a smile on her face. He fired 2 shots through her skull, her little head exploding more dramatically than the others, as if more delicate. Once done, Norman stood at the doorway, handgun still smoking in his hand. His head hung low. He dimmed the torch quietly, reverently. His mind travelled back to the tar block at Finicky, to flat 23, to the little girl probably scuttling around there, every bit as on dead as all the other quarantined. He wished he hadn't done that. Of all the many questionable things he had done in life, that quarantine, that visit to the tar block, was what Norman Coulter regretted the most. He stepped out of his storeroom quietly, turning to look at the other man who was still bent double, retching. The smell in the shop was almost unbearable. Rancid flesh pickled by spilt alcohol, and now the fresh puke of his fellow survivor. He could almost taste the virus in his mouth. Everything here was contaminated. "Let's just get out of here," Norman said, pulling the other man's arm as he made for the door. Thank you. So once again, folks, that's an excerpt from Flu, which is a book being released by Snowbooks. Should be in your little Waterstones in the next month or so. I'd be delighted if you've got a chance to pick it up. If you do get a chance to pick it up, please let me know what you think of it. My website is waynesimmons.org. Send me an email, there's a contact form and all there. Let me know what you think about it. I always like to hear what people think of this stuff. All right. How are we doing for time, Martel?
You have about 9 minutes.
9 minutes. Do you want to hear a little bit of something from Drop Dead Gorgeous?
Sure.
Yeah, it's not as long as that. Just a little bit of something. So Drop Dead Gorgeous was a kind of zombie-esque novel released through Committed Press. As I say, I've bought the rights to it back, and I've been pimping it like a bastard next door to the good folk at the Pitch Black Affair. The way I would describe Drop Dead Gorgeous, it's a little bit different to Flu. It's still very character-driven. It still has a kind of apocalyptic feel, and it's still set in Belfast, like Flu. However, Drop Dead Gorgeous is more, I suppose, a cross between Train Spotting and Dawn of the Dead, with a little bit of Asian horror thrown in for good measure. It's probably the best way to describe it. It's a bit mental, to be honest, in a good way. So, one of the things I like to write about within my books is like people, you know, and I get a lot of inspiration just travelling the train, watching people around me, talking to people in pubs and whatever. Just having a healthy social life is, I think, what all authors need to have. Particularly if you're writing character-driven fiction. And Drop Dead Gorgeous focuses a lot on the different characters involved in the book. One of the characters was probably somebody who would be less seen in the likes of a character-driven kind of horror novel, and that is an agoraphobic, alcoholic professor who basically lives in Ballyclare. Ballyclare is a shithole outside of Belfast, basically. It's like a hole in a hedge that you might drive by and miss if you didn't happen to know where it was. So this character is living in Ballyclare whenever an apocalypse hits Belfast, and this is basically the start of his story, or part of his story. Just a little bit of background: he woke up one morning completely hungover because he's alcoholic, obviously. And his wife basically looks after everything that he needs looked after. So he woke up and she hadn't set his clothes out for the day. She hadn't basically tidied up his mess from the drinking the previous night, and she hadn't been to bed. So he starts to worry that something's gone wrong. Herb reached for his bottle of bourbon, a cure for many ills. He was still in his pyjamas and dressing gown, what with Muriel not having taken the time to set out his clothes for the day like she usually did. Instead, his wife remained perfectly still and lifeless on the easy armchair opposite the sofa. The crumbs were annoying him. Muriel wouldn't like to be found like this. She was far too meticulous a person. It said little about how she was in life for crumbs to be all over her. It wasn't a Muriel that Herb had known and loved and shared his life with all these years. That Muriel was a Muriel that Herb really wanted to be with now. And so, based on this simple logic, he did something which didn't come naturally to him. He tidied. He started with Muriel herself. Carefully, Herb brushed every last crumb off her lap, then prized the teacup from her stiffening fingers. She never flinched, of course, her listless eyes remaining fixed on the television, which was still flickering soundlessly in the corner of the living room. She didn't even as much as breathe as Herb continued with his mission, folding out the collar of her blouse, replacing her slippers with her favourite shoes and sliding on her wedding ring, because she sometimes removed it for comfort. Herb wasn't sure why he expected her to move or breathe or talk. He knew deep down that she would never do any of these things again, but a part of him still expected it, longed for it all the same. Stepping back like some kind of artist, Herb examined his work. He looked at the corpse of his wife with the same critical eye that had won him a reputation for spotting the flaws in the blueprint plans of prototype engines all those years ago. And, as was the case all too often with the blueprint, he found the image wanting. The crumbs were still there. They were all over the floor, and Muriel wouldn't have liked that. And so it continued, Herb working out how to use a vacuum cleaner for the first time ever in order to suck up the offending crumbs, before moving on to every other thing that remained out of place in their home. Every unseemly thing that remained unattended to by the meticulous eye of his wife. He cleaned their small two-storey cottage from top to bottom, learning the uses of many machines and potions that he would have noticed Muriel using through the years for the first time in his life. He did it for her, but also for himself, noticing again for the first time how therapeutic cleaning and tidying could be. Once done, Herb sat himself down on the sofa opposite his wife. There was nothing else to do, so he cried. Thanks very much. If you liked what you heard of Drop Dead Gorgeous, email all the publishers upstairs and tell them that you'd like them to publish it. Thanks very much, folks.
Thank you.